Howdy, I'm Helgas, and I've been a big fan of FromSoftware long before the Soulsborne genre existed. For me, the studio was all about the giant mechs hitting other giant mechs with their Armored Core series. However, when 2010 came around, that series started to really dwindle down from the studio, and I would end up trying out their other styles of games with Bloodborne, a game that I hated at first and returned after the first 2 hours of playing it thinking that it was genuinely bad. After a year or so, I would pick it back up at half the cost and give it a real college try. And despite it still being the launch version, because I didn't have internet at the time, I fell in love with it. And somehow to this day, it is my favorite out of the Soulsborne games. But this has always made me wonder how the studio went from mainly focusing on mechs, with your random RPGs sprinkled throughout the years, to only focusing on Souls-like titles with some random action games sprinkled in. So pick up your Ravens and try not to get over-encumbered as we look at how Demon Souls miraculously avoided cancellation multiple times and ended up being the catalyst for a new genre of action RPGs. Now, I can't talk about Dark Souls without talking about what FromSoft was before the creator of Dark Souls joined, as I find it's important to understand the studio's history, as FromSoftware was quite an oddball studio. They were originally founded in 1986, and FromSoft would start as a business developer, where they would specialize in office management programs, which is them just building things like a custom payroll program and database management tools and logistics software. Now, these programs weren't sold to the public. Instead, FromSoft would get hired by a business to create whatever kind of office tools that they needed. After creation, they would help maintain these services, but this led to each program being unique to each client. And this strategy would work fine for many studios in Japan in the 80s due to the software market being more of a Wild West state. And things would continue being fine until the 90s hit, as the Japanese economy would crash, causing for many to get into some financial struggles. And to make matters worse, the business software department would take a massive hit, as Western giants like Microsoft and IBM would finally start getting a foothold in Japan. Now, IBM's and Microsoft's strategy was to sell standardized software, which means instead of needing a specialized studio to create all your programs and all your spreadsheets and all this and that, you instead could just do it yourself with Microsoft spreadsheets. That's just the easiest example that I can think of to explain this a little bit better. And these services ate up the market like crazy, and it would start killing out the need for a specialized studio to make you custom office tools, leading to many studios having to close up shop. Now, many studios did try fighting back against Microsoft and all that, but it wouldn't matter because the clients would leave in droves because it was just cheaper to do it yourself. And while a good chunk of studios closed down, FromSoftware refused to just sit there and let themselves close. As a studio's founder, and I do apologize if I mispronounce any of these names, I'm not Japanese, so you're gonna get my best attempts. Naotoshi Zin knew that he had a team of talented programmers and decided that the studio was going to pivot into gaming. The studio's first game would be a 3D RPG that was inspired by the Wizardry series, which saw many titles throughout the 80s. Now, if the team could actually finish this game was still up in the air, but the team's confidence would change after a massive stroke of luck hit them, as Sony was getting prepared to launch the PlayStation 1. And because Sony had no faith in the PlayStation, they would send PlayStation's creator Ken Kutagari out to a whole bunch of developers to get them on board, because the PlayStation's biggest weakness was that Sony didn't have any of their own development studios. So there would be a lacking amount of first-party games. So Sony's plan was to get as many developers on board for their new console, and most of the time this led to some pretty good deals for developers. And with Sony being kinda desperate with this strategy, they would knock at every studio's doors, from giants like Namco to the really small and unknown teams like FromSoftware. Sony would help the FromSoft's first game, Kingsfield, get over the finish line, which would be the studio's first success, and it would turn into its own series. And while Kingsfield was a success, they would also start experimenting with a more complex mecha action RPG title called Armored Core, which was even a bigger success for the studio, to the point where it would become the main FromSoftware franchise. But having this backbone allowed for the studio to play around and experiment with other various RPG titles, to them even trying out various different genres, from horror games to full-blown action games based on random mangas. And with FromSoftware being such a niche company until recently, I believe that many people underestimate how much the Armored Core series carried this company, which created the perfect setting that anyone in the studio could create their own game. And I guess this is the perfect time to talk about how Miyazaki ended up getting hired. While FromSoftware was becoming a sustainable studio, Hideaki Miyazaki, the man who would eventually create Dark Souls, would graduate from high school. And at this time, he was a bit aimless in where he wanted his future to go. So he'd just kind of pick a random degree to go grab, leading to him getting a degree in social science, which allowed him to get a job at the IT company Oracle, which he would stay there for a few years, but his career would take an abrupt turn when his friend got him to play Ico on the PS2. As that game quite literally changed his life and his perspective on what video games could be, with him seeing that the medium has unlimited possibilities, that anyone could make anything, which led him to change his career as he was going to make a game and the lack of coding or design skills wasn't going to stop him. Now you might be under the assumption that he went off and learned code either manually or went back to school to go do it. But he wanted to make a game, so instead of going through all of those shenanigans, he would just jump straight into the deep end by applying to multiple game studios, where unsurprisingly, he would constantly get turned down by multiple studios. Until he came across FromSoftware, and for one reason or another, they hired him. As to why would you hire someone like this? I don't fucking know. So I'm going to speculate that it was cheaper to hire someone with little knowledge or skills and just train them on the job versus getting someone that already had their degree in all this. But regardless of reason, his first role was a designer and planner for Armored Core Last Raven during the final half of its development. After finishing Last Raven, he was thrown into the console's next generation, with him being the director for Armored Core 4, and I know that it seems like a weird move to put a newcomer in charge of the company's main franchise, but this is quite common in the industry because you kinda can't make brand new game directors if you don't give someone a shot. And FromSoftware was a busy little studio at the time, with them having about 7 games in development at once. Now, a majority of these games never saw the light of the day and ended up getting cancelled, and even though more talent clearly got freed up with cancelling these games, it's not really common to take a director off of a project mid-development unless there was a lot of problems, because normally you have to see it through and let their vision fully play out, because if you start adding more directors, you can just get a fucking mishmash of a game with a whole bunch of different ideas, and it just doesn't work well. And during his time on Armored Core 4, FromSoftware and Sony would start talking about making a brand new PS3 exclusive. Just like how I gave context for FromSoftware, I'm going to have to do the same for Sony throughout the PS3 generation, as this additional context allows us to realize why certain decisions were made for Demon's Souls, versus us judging the decision when we have the knowledge and the hindsight that the Souls formula was already successful critically and financially, because Sony was in a different position then versus now, as Sony was on top of the world, as the success of the PS1 accelerated Sega leaving the console space even faster, while also being able to dethrone Nintendo was an impressive feat for a first-timer. But they didn't stop there, as their position on top furthered with the PS2, which added a DVD player, which gave the console massive value in the early 2000s. While Nintendo was having struggles as the GameCube didn't have any online, had less space due to them using tiny little mini DVD things, I don't remember what they're called. And then Sony was also able to stand head to head against Microsoft's brand new Xbox. And throughout this time, Sony seemed more like a, and I'm going to use the biggest air quotes I got, the everyday man of the console space. Because their consoles were more than just a console for their times. Like if you needed a high quality music player with most of the bells and whistles that an audiophile would love, pick up a PS1. Or do you need a decent DVD player? Then come and get yourself a PS2, which became the ultimate family entertainment system. Hell, did you want premium games but you're on a tight budget? Then come nab yourself some PlayStation hit games, which were normally the biggest games but at $20 brand new. And these strategies really won over consumers. But then we get to the PS3, and Sony's tone has changed. For starters, the Xbox 360 came out a year earlier, and it had an entire year of support before the PS3 even launched. By 2006, the 360 had games like The Elder Scrolls Oblivion, Gears of War 1, Dead Rising 1, and Rainbow Six Vegas 1. And those are just a few examples. They had a lot of big bangers between 2005 and 2006. And with the 360 being priced at $300, which gave you the bare minimum things that you need to play, you could also get a $400 version for the console with some small upgrades like a 20GB hard drive, which was a pretty decent size for the time. And while gamers were eating good with the 360, Sony was ready in 2006 to show what their new generation was going to be. So to start this new generation off, they would announce that rumble in their controllers was a thing of the past. Why? Well, that was just a last generation feature. Or as Sony said, as instead they had a lawsuit going on over the rumble feature, so that's why it was originally cut. Instead, us gamers will get introduced to the 6-axis controller that uses motion controls. Something that can work in your games. I mean, fuck's sake, look at the Wii. But unlike Nintendo's rectangular console, you could tell that this was strapped on last minute because the game they showed off was Layer. Now, if you just look at this gameplay as is, it looks pretty neat. Probably would start getting a bit tedious, but this could be an interesting game like Star Fox with dragons. Even though I think that already exists with Dragon Panzer, but I guess this is Sony's next generation take on it. Now, what if I told you that instead of using the sticks and all that stuff that you had a convenient access to, you needed to tilt the entire controller left or right to steer the dragon for the entire game? Now that just seems like one of those early games that are pretty rough around the edges because they're being really forced to use one gimmick. But it'd be a game that would be announced and you just would forget about it. But this was the big game to show off the capabilities of 6-axis. And man, does it look bad in old presentations. But that wasn't the only selling point, as Sony was at war with HD DVDs for HD content. And with Sony being the only company at the time using and pushing Blu-rays, they were hoping that the format would catch on with the PS3. After all, the DVD drive was a big selling point for the PS2. Now, the difference between the DVD and the Blu-ray for your average consumer at the time was that you get a slight boost in visual quality. But it was going to take a few years since 2006 for the HD conversion in America to really kick off. But I guess since your average Blu-ray player at the time would set you back $1,000, it makes up for the PS3's eye-watering $600 price tag, which if we account for inflation, it's almost $1,000 in today's money. Jesus, that's expensive, but at least you get the pleasure to play this lackluster launch of lineup games. And naturally, the PS3 was not appealing to a lot of gamers. And just like any company that hates its players, you'd get the CEO saying shit like, and I quote, "Our goal for the PlayStation 3 is for the consumer to think to themselves, I will work for more hours to buy one. We want people to feel like they want it, irrespectively of anything else." End quote. And this was a pretty bad look. But let's move on to talk about what the PS3 did have. Well, it had a shit ton of pointless features, like you can insert an SD or a flash memory to show off pictures. That's cool, I guess. Or it had 4 different USB ports and a practically working PS2 inside. And the extra PS2 allowed for amazing backwards compatibility. But all of these extra doodads made the console cost so much more in the first place. And something else that wasn't helping Sony was all the weird fucking trailers they were putting out for their console. I guess with these abstract trailers, it was trying to sell the idea that the PS3 was a miniature supercomputer, which most consumers saw past this whole marketing push, except for the US military who bought a shit ton of them to make an actual supercomputer, which is a weird use of US funding, but whatever, who cares, that was over a decade ago. But then we also had some of the other trailers that were trying to sell you on the Cell processor, which was another unique feature of the console, and because I feel like I've been talking too long about the console itself, think of the Cell as a multi-core processor just with some extra steps, which is a really watered down version of what it is, but that's kind of the main gist of what you need. It was ahead of its time for a console, but going this route also made the console really hard to develop for, because of the Cell being so much more complicated than multi-processors. And all of this led to the PS3 stumbling in America hard when it came to sales. This would start a weird era for Sony, where they would try any and everything to win players back. And I'd like to dub this time as Sony's Vulture era, as they would be looking at anything other companies would be doing and either trying to copy it or beat them to the punch, with various levels of success. And early on, one of the biggest things that Sony wanted to try to vulture up themselves was the first-person RPG, because Sony was watching Microsoft's exclusive The Elder Scrolls Morrowind and Oblivion, which were killing it both critically and financially. So Sony would devise their best strategy that they still do to this day, where they would piss and shit themselves that their developers weren't making the big popular thing everybody else was making, where they would either pester their devs until they actually go on and make that genre that they wanted, or they would be a bit more forceful to get the genre they want. And with Sony wanting their own first-person RPG, we can finally talk about Demon's Souls. And Sony already knew the perfect company that already had experience with the FPS RPG. So they would approach FromSoftware, where they pitched the idea of rebooting the Kingsfield series to compete with Elder Scrolls, which is really weird considering how different the two styles of games are. Now, since we don't know the entire details of the deal that Sony was offering, but considering the game that we ended up getting, I think it's fair to assume that Sony gave FromSoftware absolute freedom to create whatever they wanted. Now, having a publisher approach you doesn't really happen too often. And when it does, the company normally hits that studio with a lot of creative freedom and a decent sized budget. But this always comes at the cost that the studio is not able to keep the IP, so if the game was a success, the developer would have to go up and ask the publisher to be able to make a sequel, versus them just being able to do that without the publisher's permission. The ability to get that freedom regardless of success tends to be a no-brainer for any studio to agree with this. But this is always a big risk on the publisher side. Since the developer didn't bring something to be looked at as a proof of concept or a vertical slice, a project like this can quickly be derailed, which happened to this version of Demon's Souls as it entered development hell and didn't even get past the prototyping phase. Things were so bad for the project that FromSoft would start putting less and less effort into the game with hopes that Sony would outright cancel it. Now if you're wondering why would you even want to put more resources into a project that's clearly going nowhere, well, whenever you're working with a big publisher, you always want to look busy even if the game starts to go to the shitter. Because if they actively are still giving you money and your team is doing nothing, a good amount of contracts would demand that that developer needs to pay back any development costs that they used. And depending on the scope and scale of a game, that can quickly hurt or even kill a studio. But there's also an even worse fate, and that is when a publisher believes that you're misusing the funds, which can lead to lawsuits. And these tend to be more expensive and do some damage to your brand. The biggest one that comes to my mind is when Sega sued Gearbox for alleged misuse funds for Aliens Colonial Marines, as Sega believed Gearbox took the money and put it into Borderlands 2. And that's just an example, you can look into it yourself to see how that all played out. So it was best to give a small amount of effort versus dealing with any sort of trouble that they could have gotten into. Demon's Souls' troubled development was something that was echoed through FromSoftware, with many devs aware of its development woes, and it would just keep trudging on. But everything changed when the original director of Demon's Souls left the project, and that news hit Miyazaki's ears and he would immediately request to be put onto the project as the director, because he didn't really care if the game was going to be cancelled, as he was just going to use this as an opportunity to create his own RPG. Because at the end of the day, if you create something interesting that even if Sony pulls out, maybe FromSoftware would find a new publisher and just keep the game going. Because this was just good experience for him to get regardless, and can lead to him being able to make his own RPG anyway if the game was cancelled. His request would be approved, and he would become the director of A Perfect Storm, to create something truly unique that the studio believed was never going to see the light of day. Now, when one is creating a game with a publisher, normally that publisher will send out a producer to check in on the game's progress. These producers will then look at the game and decide if it's a project the company should invest more money and time into, which leaves producers with a lot of power over development. And Demon's Souls got Sony producer Takashi Kaji, who I personally believe is the reason why this game didn't get cancelled. But my reasons on that will come up later, because at this stage both Kaji and Miyazaki would figure out the direction for the game. And I guess these two were the perfect pairing, as the two had the same idea as to what makes an RPG game fun to them. As these two loved RPGs that harken back to old game design, where players had to figure out what to do on their own, not have a whole bunch of markers or waypoints spelling out what to do next. Now I do need to make a quick distinction when talking about older game design, as Wizardry is yet again another game that inspired Demon's Souls, which has a bigger focus on dungeon crawling and exploring. Or if you want a less niche game, another example is look at any Legend of Zelda in the 80s and early 90s. Hell, you can feel this with the boss designs of Demon's Souls far more than you can with the rest of the franchise, as most of the bosses in these games have direct counters like a lot more of your classic games would have. Now even though they took inspiration on classic games, one thing they didn't want to take was the old school difficulty design, as older games had a hard time figuring out replayability due to manufacturing costs and technological limitations. So the cheapest method of adding replayability was making the games stupid hard. Something the Souls games didn't want because, unlike popular beliefs, the series wasn't supposed to be about difficulty. Instead, the game was about giving you an obstacle that you had to overcome, and not just be stupid hard for the sake of being stupid hard. I know this is going to touch on Dark Souls a little bit, and I think it's really important to understand that the only reason that Dark Souls' marketing pushed the idea that this game is super hard and only the most gamers of gamers can beat it, which is why we got the Dark Souls 1 Prepare to Die edition name slapped onto it. And that's only because it's easier to market the game that way than it is to try to show off all the unique things in Dark Souls 1. Like, genuinely go back and look at some Dark Souls 1 trailers, you'll see that they're legitimately a hodgepodge of shots for no goddamn reason. And this direction of marketing was something that Miyazaki didn't even like, and was against it the entire time, but again, it was just easier for them to market, so they ran with the idea. But that's enough of this small tangent, so let's get back to Demon's Souls' development. With the power of both Kanji and Miyazaki, the game direction would drastically shift from being a Kingsfield reboot into its own IP. One that would take some influences from Kingsfield, whether intentional or not, as the world building took influence from European folklore, an idea that wasn't dabbled with too much for JRPGs at this time. Plus, going this route allowed for the team to go all out with the dark fantasy element, which was a style that the team adored. So they spent a year of development on just world design to get it set in stone, which also includes them figuring out a chunk of the dedicated gimmicks and obstacles that players would have to deal with. Now, something I don't see often when people talk about the Souls series is that it seems that any game that Miyazaki is a director of, he likes to put self-restrictions onto his game. For Demon's Souls, he wanted to use as little cinematics as possible since he believed that other games overuse cinematics, which takes players out of their world. Now, going this route, also intentionally or not, made any other cinematics that they used have far greater importance. But as the team was figuring out the amount of cutscenes to be made, Kanji would request for a heroine character to be made, leading to the creation of the Maiden in Black, whose original design didn't have anything covering her eyes. However, with her character having a few close-up shots in cinematics, her original low-poly eyes stood out. So instead of adding more money, they just went and covered them up due to a tight deadline. And this is something that happens a lot throughout the franchise, where the second half of development gets extremely rushed. And when you're on a tight deadline, it's better to be resourceful in finding smaller little solutions that at first might seem like band-aid solutions, but as long as it gets the job done, not that many people are gonna care. Versus hoping that you can get your publisher to give you an extension, either on a budget side or on development side, because those kind of extensions and delays aren't as nearly as common as you might think with the industry. Or at the worst of times, the devs would look at a problem and then say something that probably hundreds of developers throughout all decades have probably said of, there's no goddamn time, it's playable, that's good enough, ship it. Which is why we get some bad performing areas in these games. For Demon's Souls, it's that swamp area, for Dark Souls, it's Blighttown. But with such a tight deadline, there would be a few things that would end up being cut. The one that is talked about the most is the Sixth World, which has its mountains and stomach yetis, which we only know about due to data mining. But we do know about a few more thanks to various interviews that Miyazaki did throughout the years. As he has revealed that there was supposed to be this really big library area, I don't know where it would fit in the game, but that was something that got cut, and that the Nexus was supposed to have an entirely explorable outside area. Why they were cut was probably just due to time restrictions. There might be other reasons as to maybe it killed the flow of the game, but only those at FromSoft know the reasons why. Now, considering the circumstances Demon's Souls had, the development overall went as smooth as it could be. So when the game was getting close to its release date, Sony would start looking at it in more depth. And this is where the Sony CEO, Shuhei Yoshida, would sit down and play the game for about 2 hours before calling it an incredibly bad game. An infamous quote from Sony, and is used by many to say that Sony dropped the ball on the publishing side of Demon's Souls. A statement I cannot agree with because, again, a lot of these people are saying this with the hindsight of us knowing that the Souls series is a success, and not taking into account what was actually happening with Demon's Souls at the time, and how it almost never even came out to the West in the first place. But we're gonna get to that soon. Now, if you heard this and wondered why Sony would greenlight a game and then get surprised by what the devs actually gave them, after all, in game development, there tends to be meetings between devs, producers, and some executives to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Which in an ideal world, that would be the case. However, we have to remember how weird the development has been already. As originally Sony signed up for a Kingsfield reboot, only being presented with a brand new IP that moved away from the first-person RPG. So that's pretty odd, but not too unheard of in game development. I mean, Halo started as an RTS before turning into an FPS. But unlike a chunk of games, what Sony actually knew about Demon's Souls was pretty limited, as both Kaji and Miyazaki purposely kept big mechanics hidden from the executives. Like, to give you an idea of the scale of how things were hidden, one of the biggest mechanics that the Souls series is known for, the you die, you drop your currency / souls, and then you have one life to go pick it back up, and since that's such a core component to the game, it's insane that Sony did not know about that until obviously, the CEO got to play the game. And then there are a lot of other bizarre mechanics that were just too hard to explain to a group of higher-ups. For example, how the hell do you go and explain world tendency? Because remember, you have to explain how the mechanic's going to work on like a more technical level, then tell them why it matters to your game, why the company should allocate X amount of money for servers, And then you'd also have to explain the asynchronous online, and it just becomes a lot to explain to just one group of people that just wanted an Elder Scrolls game. So it does make sense of how Yoshida got whiplash when trying out the game for the first time. Now, something else I don't see people bring up when they talk about this is how Sony was only making bad decisions with Demon's Souls. They weren't even trying to market the game, which is just not really true because Sony was trying, as they would end up showing the game at the Tokyo Game Show of 2008, which is a gaming convention that prioritizes Japanese game developers, and their upcoming games tend to have short hands-on demos. And for some reason, Demon's Souls was there, and I'm just gonna go into the assumption that Sony thought it would be fine to advertise Demon's Souls like how they did with every other game at the time. And there was some excitement from the gaming press in Japan, as many heard that Sony was making a new RPG, and that studio tends to have a decent track record with the genre. And it was pretty intriguing that it was running with a dark fantasy setting, something that wasn't too popular at the time. And then the demo that players got was only 10 minutes, and it contained a character creation, which is weird for such a short demo, but I guess since in recent times we've been seeing a lot of other companies release demos in air quotes, but they're just their character creators, like Dragon's Dogma 2, I think Code Vein 2 did that as well. So I guess character creator has always been a big factor to some of these games. But those that did play at the convention were pretty confused as to why Sony was even showing off this game, because to a lot of the journalists there, they thought the game's combat was pretty early in design, even though in reality they were practically playing with the final version of the combat. And its showing at TGS was just really bad, as a lot of people just didn't really get it. And that's just being really nice about its showing. After its Tokyo Game Show mess, Sony would start getting cold feet with Demon's Souls. Now this wasn't only the game's fault, as the PS3 was still not doing that great at the time, so releasing a stinker could do a lot more damage to the brand than just cancelling it. This led to Sony re-evaluating the game, and here's where I believe that Kaji saved the game. And after the TGS disaster, it was really clear that Sony had a lot more eyes on Demon's Souls. And during this period, they had to spill the beans on what everything the game needed to have. And this included why the game needed servers for a single player game. Because the idea of asynchronous online was a pretty new idea, but since Demon's Souls wasn't winning any executives over, Miyazaki and Kaji had to explain these things like world tendency and the oddball multiplayers with pictures as if the executives were kids, which I would say would be insulting, but apparently the higher-ups still didn't get what the fuck was going on with the servers needed for this game. Now, how the game handles multiplayer was already divisive for the higher-ups, as PlayStation was really trying to push their online features, since this was the era of multiplayer games being the big feature of the console generation, especially since Sony was trying to play a bit of catch up with the Xbox's well-established Xbox Live. So a weird online feature didn't make sense versus having a basic party system that other RPGs had. And I have no idea of what either Kaji or Miyazaki said, but for better or worse, they would win the argument to keeping the multiplayer as is. Now, on the business side of things, I guess Sony just let this be in the game because the devs already built all the features around it. Or I guess because of the fact that the producer was fighting tooth and nail for these features that they just kinda went, fuck it, why not? And this brings me to my least favorite portion of this entire script, as we're gonna have to talk about the development costs. Now, I personally don't like talking about these because there tends to be a lot of incorrect information when it comes to game budgets. The most recent example we have is Concord, with people saying, oh, they spent 200 million. No, wait, it's 300 million now. Hang on, it's actually 400 million. Who's saying this? Random people that didn't have anything to do with the fucking development in the game? Wow, that's great. I love it when they use speculation used to sell highlights of how bad something is, even though we don't know how bad it really was. But unlike other games I've covered in the disaster report, this is the first time I've seen the stigma that ex-publisher is fucking stupid that they would miss out on this cash cow, which downplays the decisions that I made in the moment from these studios, and my goal with the disaster report is to show how development of a game happens on both the developer and publisher side of things, because there's a lot of assumptions on how video games are actually made on the AAA scale. But this also means that we get to talk about some more context for the PS3, baby! When you're tasked with making a console exclusive game, there's a big push from the publisher to show all the bells and whistles that a console can have. But not only that, but you have to make the best of the best game so that you can also entice people to go and buy said console. Something the PS3 was struggling with due to high price, which it did see a few price slashes to make it more appealing, as the PS3 was also struggling to get some good exclusives for the platform, because there were quite a few exclusives at the time, but they were such opposite of extremes. Like sure, you could have a massive hit like Uncharted or Resistance, or you could be a Magus, a Lair, a Haze. Games that were just fucking bad. And Haze was so bad that it ended up fully shutting down their studio. And then the PS3 was also struggling with the fact that there wasn't great incentive to push into the next gen. Because the PS2 was still getting heavy support, and like that DVD player is still a lot cheaper than getting a PS3. And this led to the PS2 generation lasting for way too long. These facts alone made the PS3 a hard sell to gamers, and many of them were running to the Xbox 360, at least in America, so Sony was struggling in North America and Europe. But in Japan it was a different story, as the 360 was seen as a joke, allowing for PlayStation to really take over in that one region. In fact, by the time it was 2009, the PS3 hit 3 million sales, while the Xbox 360 hit 1 million. But it was still pretty worrying for Sony, as Xbox was still trying to really penetrate the Japanese market, which saw some success, as there was a time where Xbox outsold the PS3 throughout various months in 2008 and 2009. Plus, Xbox was also pushing to work with Japanese developers to get exclusive JRPGs throughout 2005 to the end of 2010, which was bad for Sony, as all it could take was one really good exclusive for that gap to close. So Sony was willing to try all sorts of gimmicks to get players on board. One of the big ones was to have free online play compared to Xbox Live. And at this time, the PlayStation Move would be in development to try to tackle their biggest competition of this era, the Wii. However, as 2008 went and passed, the financial crisis would hit, causing all businesses to cut back on spending. So I find the fact that Demon's Souls got its odd multiplayer to be seen as a good investment from Sony even more surprising. Maybe the lack of CGI cutscenes cut the costs back so much that it justified the server's cost. But Demon's Souls would release in Japan February of 2009, where the reviews were mixed, with them being a bit more on the positive side of things, and the game would sell 39,000 copies in its first week of Japan. And in some old articles and forums, there would be a lot of Westerners that would scream that this is amazing launch numbers. Now, people screaming that was just because they wanted their game to come to the West, because in reality, this is some terrible sales for a single region. So now it's time to really go into depth about the development cost, and we're going to have to keep in mind that this is going to be some speculation on a few things, because the game's budget has never been set by Sony, but looking at some of their other games, it's safe to say that the game probably had a budget close to $10 million. Because the game was greenlit during the start of the PS3, and the game budget at the start of the PS3 generation for AAA games was still around the $10 million mark. And that's without marketing, and I don't know how to factor that since Sony only released this game in Japan. And with me not being able to factor certain things, we're just gonna give Demon's Souls the best scenario that never existed for the game, as I'm going to be keeping the math super simple just to prove the point that this game failed in Japan. Because in reality, Demon's Souls need to make a lot more. Because when you go to different storefronts that sell video games, they like to try to take a 10 to 30% cut depending on store. Now, I'm not going to even try to incorporate that with the upcoming numbers. I want to make this as fair as possible, but you also have to understand that the numbers that I give are probably significantly lower than what was happening in reality. Let's say that the game needed to make $10 million to break even. And with 39,000 copies, that's roughly $2.3 million made. So the game still needed to generate $7.7 million in order to break even, which is a really rough start as most game sales tend to happen during the first few weeks of the game's launch. By December of 2009, the game ended up selling 134,585 copies in Japan, equaling roughly to $8 million, so they still needed to make $2 million. And keep in mind, these numbers might sound impressive, but at this time, the PS3 has sold 3 million units. So them not even breaking to like 500,000 units is really bad for this game. By all means, this game flops in Japan, but this also puts Sony into a really weird position, because all it needs to do is make 2 million, which could be easily hit if you released it in the American or European market. But seeing how bad the launch was in Japan, Sony got cold feet about the other regions. Because you also have to remember that Japan tends to be that one region that likes a whole bunch of wacky things in their RPGs, and a lot of those games tend to do really well still. And again, since this is the best case scenario, I'm not even incorporating the fact that they would have to spend even more money for the other regions, because the game would have to be localized, and then you have to make marketing that would appeal to those other regions, and then there's have to be QA for the localizations, servers getting set up, the QA for the servers for the other regions, and then all the manufacturing that would have to go into this. So not knowing how successful the game would be, it's too easy to overcreate the amount of physical copies, since digital games were not too popular for console players. And with this being a big title from Sony, they would probably have to pay even extra in slotting fees to get these manufactured games onto the store shelves. And all this extra cost was just not worth it, especially if the game ended up having the same performance as Japan. So looking at Demon's Souls with this context, it's easy to see that Sony wasn't the fools with how they handled Demon's Souls. The only reason people say that is because they're missing out on all the extra information and because of the hindsight bias we have. So if Sony willing to just walk away from Demon's Souls and take a small loss, another studio would walk in, as Atlus, makers of Shin Megami Tensei and the Persona franchise, stepped into the picture, where a higher up was playing the game and thought it was a pretty neat experience, and after hearing Sony didn't have plans to bring it to the other regions, they would strike a deal, shooting Sony a licensing deal to publish the game. And again, we don't know what that looks like, but I'm gonna figure that there was two options that Atlus did, one being paying a lump sum just to get the publishing rights, which just covered Sony's losses, or maybe a lump sum that wasn't a full $2 million, but instead a smaller amount, with each version of the game having a small percentage going back to Sony. Regardless of the method, we have to remember that it's far easier for Atlus to make their money back versus Sony. And because I completely forgot about this until just now, Demon's Souls would also have to be marketed differently if Sony was doing it, because they're using it to be like, hey, buy a PS3. As for Atlus, they're just showing off the game to PS3 owners and going, isn't this cool? Wouldn't you want to buy this? Which is a very different style of marketing and how the game has to be handled in general. And even with Atlus going out of their way to buy the rights for this game, it seems that they didn't even have a lot of faith in the game, as they would only print 75,000 copies, which equal to around $4.5 million of potential sales. It would release in October of 2009 in America, where the most unexpected thing happened, as the first month sold 150,000 copies, then another 100,000 copies the next month, tripling the original amount printed. This game's success surprised both Sony and Atlus, as typically the American market tends to be far pickier when it comes to what games they want to play. Now, with Atlus trying to keep up with the demand, they were interested in trying to publish the game for Europe, but another gaming vulture would awake at the sound of easy money, as Bandai Namco would swoop in and release Demon's Souls in June of 2010 for the European market. And after 2011, with all the regions accounted for, the game would sell over 1 million units, making this trouble game a success, allowing for Miyazaki to follow up on his second reign of terror, Dark Souls. But that's a story for a different day. And that's the story of Demon's Souls. And now, originally this was going to be a part of a bigger video that covered the entire franchise, but I could never get the script into a state I was happy with, so I figured just giving out Demon's Souls and then tackling the rest of the franchise at a later date was just the better choice. And I do apologize for how long it's taken to make another big video like this. There's been a lot going on in my own life and all that. Like, I've had to move 4 different times, one of those having to be to a new state, and I'm hoping that things have finally calmed down a bit so I can start getting videos at a decent rate. And I haven't forgotten about the video game article database. It's just in a state of being slow because I'm just in the process of trying to catch up a whole bunch of things. Hopefully I'll be able to get a big update soon with all my findings about the Burnout series, which will eventually be another video. Yeah, I guess that's all the quick updates I have. So I guess if you like this video, why not subscribe? It doesn't cost you a thing. If you hate the video, I don't know, let me know why, I guess. Until next time, have a fantastic day.